Should we be using feathers or blunt swords? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now this is one of those debates, discussions that comes around every few, I was going to say every few years, but probably every few months. Or it certainly used to be. These days, it's been a little while actually. And I don't exactly know what sort of instigated it, but in the last couple of weeks I've noticed a lot of discussions talking about feathers and whether people studying historical longsword systems should be or shouldn't be using feathers. Just for those of you who don't know what the feather is, just very briefly and quickly to describe, it is one of these things. It is a blunt, flexible sword with a flared shield, as it's called, and they probably weren't called feathers in period, they were called federschwert and various other things, but essentially it's like a foil, a practice weapon for longsword, and they are shown in German, or certainly German language treatises specifically. So why does this question come up, whether we should or shouldn't be using them? Well, quite simply, they are specifically shown in German language treatises such as Regenyei. They're shown in various other treatises that from the Lichtenau lineage, and very clearly these were popular things in Germany. And some people argue that blunt swords are a better training tool than these are for various reasons that we'll look at in a second. And additionally, I study, or I teach as well, Fiori de Liberis treatise, and the fact is that the systems from Italy, there is no evidence that they used something that looked exactly like a federschwert, certainly in terms of having the flared shield, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So we can say that this is a specifically German or German longsword training weapon. There are single-handed versions as well. We see in Mayer, we see a so-called rapier, which is more like a side sword in his case, but we do see a one-handed version of one of these as well. But they do seem to be associated with the German fencing traditions, and we don't really see them, for example, in Italian treatises, and there's no evidence from art that they were used in France or Spain or England, as far as I have ever seen. So for various reasons, some people argue that we shouldn't be using these for all longsword trainings. People doing Fiori shouldn't use them, or just generally that they're not very good training tools for simulating what a real sword is like. Well, let's just break that down. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of depth. I'm going to try and keep this as concise as possible. But fundamentally, what is this mechanically? Well, clearly, a lot of people don't like this object because of what it looks like. Okay, we can't really talk about the length or the weight or the whatever, because the fact is that these come in a variety of lengths and weights. You can have the hilt of any length you want, you can have the blade of any length you want, you can have the shield in different styles, and we've got surviving examples of these in museums. There's some in Switzerland, there's some in Arundel in England, there's various ones in private collections around the world. And the fact is that these vary a lot, but there is one important difference between the modern HEMA version of a feather or federschwert and all of the surviving originals that I'm aware of, and that is the point. So to get to the point, the fact is that we put forms of blunt tip on the end, either a flared tip or a rolled tip. And the simple fact is that as far as I'm aware, none of the originals have that. All of the originals have a flat and in some cases rather thin and almost sharp spatulate point. That it's rounded, but it's very flat and thin, and you certainly wouldn't want to get thrust in the face by one. Not to say that you'd want to be thrust in the face of one of these as well, but we wear fencing masks, and it should also be yet again reiterated, as I mentioned in lots of videos. Of course, in the medieval period they didn't have or use fencing masks, and there's no evidence of them using something like that. There's tangentially some mention of the Belgian fencing guilds using some form of head protection, but we don't know if it had a facial protection element to it. But the simple fact is that the way that they were using federschwerts to try and make the opponent's head bleed and things like this are probably quite different to how we're using them now. So the simple fact is that what people have done is they have looked at original feathers, if we call them that. They've looked at the artwork, and then they've based these replicas, and I've got a couple of other makes I'll talk about in a second here. This is a Regenyei one. but they've based these on what they see in the art and the originals, but then they've tweaked them for our sensibilities and for our needs, fencing with fencing masks, fencing with contact with thrusts and cuts. Remember, some guilds or some fencing competitions didn't allow thrusts, so therefore what's on the tip doesn't matter because they're only hitting with the edge. But anyway, we've modified these into safe fencing weapons. Now, I guess the headline that I want to make here is I have over the years been one of those people who has argued that certainly for Fiore we should be perhaps looking at something that looks a little bit more like the Italians might have been using at that time as a practice weapon, rather than using the federschwert, because the simple fact is, just from appearance, this is a thing that we only really see in the German language treatises, so within the sphere of the Holy Roman Empire. We don't see any evidence of these in Italy or England, Spain, wherever else, okay? But that being said, is there really a big difference between a feder and a blunt sword? Well, it depends on the feder and it depends on the blunt sword. I'll just grab a different feder, just for a bit of variety. This is a Sigi Forge version. Now, quite simply, it is a flexible blade, okay, to make it safer in the thrust. It is a blunt blade, as formerly mentioned, on the tip and on the edges, and it has a shield. Now, the shield serves several purposes, which I'm not going to go into here, but I've discussed them in the past. Partly it adds a bit to the hand protection, partly it adds a bit of mass to the blade without having the mass up here in the central percussion which you're hitting with, so it puts the mass down here. And they are quite narrow blades, so that means they're, generally speaking, they don't have quite as much mass towards the tip, which changes their inertia. So by reducing the amount of inertia towards the tip, it means that they're not going to hit quite as heavily as a broad-bladed sword will hit when you strike someone with it, whether it's sharp or blunt. So quite simply, these are a little bit safer for striking with, given that they're narrow up here, but you don't necessarily need the hilt to achieve that. In terms of the hilts are basically the same as any other longsword hilt, so nothing to really be said there. But you can, of course, make a blunt sword that doesn't look like a federschwert without the shield on it, and you've got a blunt sword. And are they really very different? And that's the kind of main point I want to make here. Now, I'm going to put the feder down for a second and pick up a different sword that's very, very popular, probably in HEMA in 2021. It's probably the second most popular weapon after longsword, and that is saber. Debatably, you could say it's rapier, but I'll talk about those in a second as well. Now, this saber blade has all of the fundamental same properties as those feder blades we were just looking at. It's blunt edged, it's flexible, it's got a rolled tip. So the only difference between this and the federschwert blade is that it doesn't have a shield on it. Yeah, of course, it's got a saber hilt and it's got a saber shaped blade, but fundamentally it's a blunt, flat, flexible blade with a safe tip. So functionally, and it's narrow up here as well, it's not as broad as a real saber. So functionally, it's not very different to a federschwert, is it? Now let's have a little look at what people are using for side sword, where here's a Kvetun side sword. And yet again, it's a relatively flat, okay, it has a diamond section, but it's a relatively flat blade, but the important parts are it has a blunt edge, it has a rolled tip, and it's nice and flexible, particularly flexible in the second half. So again, functionally, is it really different to a feder blade? Well, not really, it doesn't have a shield, that's the only thing. And if someone got rid of the complex hilt, the finger rings and the side rings up here, and they put a flared shield on it, wow, it would look exactly like one of Joachim Meyer's rapiers, okay? But functionally, it's not really different. So is it really worth getting into big arguments about, oh, well, you know, we don't use feders, we use blunt longswords that have all of the same mechanical properties as a feder except for having a shield at the base? Okay, now we go back to an actual antique original, and here we go. Here's a so-called Gymnasium Saber, probably more often called just a practice saber in its time. A highly, highly flexible blade, a tiny amount of pressure required to flex that, with a flared tip, exactly like the modern ones we're using. This is a 1908 pattern British cavalry practice sword, incidentally. So obviously blunt edged, very flexible, nice and thin. It's got a reduced amount of inertia up towards the tip of the blade. You can cut with it, although this is primarily a thrusting sword. If we go to rapiers, for example, like the Danelli rapier behind me, that looks far more like a real sword. It's deliberately made to look more like a real sword. So for example, this particular example has blunt edges because it's made for fencing with, but it has a fuller down the blade, then it has a diamond section. It looks more like the original it was based on, but it has a fat, thickened tip, 8mm I think, and the flex of this is very different to the original rapier blade because it is designed to be more flexible. Okay, so it's safe in the thrust. And in terms of the rapier, well, you don't need to particularly change the blade to make it safe in the cut because it doesn't have a lot of inertia towards the tip anyway. Although I will say, because of the increased length of a rapier blade, you get quite a lot of acceleration in the tip. So it does actually hit quite hard. And when you've got a flared tip, that introduces more inertia because you have mass located at the tip of the weapon. So it kind of makes it kind of like a miniature mace in a way. So adds a little bit more inertia out towards the tip. But regardless, from a functional point of view, yes, it doesn't have a shield, but it is a blunt, flexible, blunt-tipped blade. It's not that different to the feathers, okay? So really, when we get into these discussions about to feather or not to feather, what we're really talking about is what it looks like. I think we all pretty much agree that to some degree, the blades that we use for practice, whether they have a shield or not, they have to be blunt. Okay, they have to be flexible to some degree. This is actually a very stiff one I've just picked up. This is a Kvetun. They have to be flexible to some degree and they have to have a blunt tip. Yeah, so clearly blunt edge, blunt tip, either a shield or not a shield. That's your taste, that's your whatever. And usually, to make them safer, they usually have some degree of reduced inertia towards the tip. So particularly if you're simulating something like a saber, which if you're the real version of a saber is actually maybe designed to have quite a bit of inertia towards the tip to cut more effectively, to make it safe for sparring, and this would be true of something like Langmesser or falchion, to make it safer for sparring you usually have to reduce the inertia out towards the tip somehow. Some people might not, but I think for safe sparring weapons you usually need to achieve that somehow. Now the only things really actually that we've got to debate about is the amount of pressure it takes to flex a blade. So this is a really stiff blade, this particular one, and this is a this is a Caveton. Yeah, Caveton example. So this is a really stiff one. If I pick up the Sigi forge one, this is more flexible. And if I pick up the Regenyei one, it's about in the middle between those two. Now, full disclosure, these three feathers are all brand new, and I will very soon be doing a review of these three feathers. The only reason I haven't done it before now is quite simply, the clubs aren't open at the moment. Okay, so we're still kind of locked down, pandemic lockdown in terms of running the clubs. So I'm limited into how much I can test these, but I am going to be doing a, shall we say, a non-physical testing review of these three swords, fit and finish, flex, those types of things, coming up relatively soon. But the fact is that your feathers can vary in terms of their mass, in terms of their flexibility, in terms of what type of safe tip you have at the end, in terms of the edge thickness, in terms of their proportions, their length and hilt length and all of those kind of things, crossguard length. They can vary just as much as a blunt sword can. And in some cases a blunt sword, just because it's a blunt sword, might share the exact same size, mass, proportions, flexibility and everything else as a feather. Or it might be stiffer, or it might be more flexible. So really when we get into these debates about blunt sword versus feather, actually I think it's a red herring. It's completely leading you down a wrong comparison, because you can have a blunt sword that shares all of the same basic, in terms of fencing, the same basic physical characteristics as a feather does. Just the same as the sabers that we use, in terms of their mass and how they feel in the hand and everything else, are exactly like the real sharp sabers, but they are a little bit different in that they're more flexible and of course are blunt. And just the same as is true of the rapiers that we use for fencing, or the side swords that we use for fencing. Okay, none of those are feathers, I think most people will agree, but they basically share all the same characteristics as feathers. So I hope that sort of sums up my overall view of the debate. I think it's a non-debate, okay? Blunt swords, feathers, they can do the same thing, they just look a different shape. Do I think feathers are ugly? Lots of people do. Yeah, I kind of do think they're ugly actually. I've used them for years for Fiore. simply because they're widely available and that's the standard tool used in competition. Okay, but that being said, a few bits of extra information for you if you've got this far in the video. Number one, I'll be doing a review of those three feathers, Sigi, Regenyei and Caveton, which I'll be doing a fully impartial review and comparison between those three. They're all very, very good feathers. They just have slightly different, I wouldn't even say advantages and disadvantages, more like different characteristics, which you might prefer one above the other, and I'll try and set those out. The other thing to mention is that I am working on, and this has been something that I've been meaning to do for years, a Fiore feather. And if you've watched this video, you might have some inkling of what that might involve. It won't have a shield, but it will share a lot of exactly the same characteristics as a feather does. Okay, but more about that in due course. The other thing I'd mention as well is I will be talking in a minute. I'm just about to film a Patreon video for the Patreon channel, talking about something completely different, and that's small swords, and a little look at this nice new silver hilted antique example that I've got here. So as always, I'm very happy to read your comments underneath this video. Do you agree? Do you disagree? What are your thoughts? I mean, I don't see how you could massively disagree with what I've said in this video, but I'm happy to see your views of this. Do you hate feathers? Do you think they're horrible? Do you think they look horrible? Or, as some people have suggested, are they very good because they are iconic and they look different to reenactment swords or Shinai or whatever else other people are using, and so they are seen as HEMA? Are they quite useful for branding, for example? So do they have a use which is beyond their mere appearance and practical purpose? Do you think that removing the shield on a feather is a really bad thing? And if so, why? So I'm very interested to hear all of those things. If you're not subscribed, please consider doing so. If you are subscribed, please make sure you click that notification bell for notifications of new videos. And I'll either see you very soon back here for another video on the channel, or I'll see you on Patreon really soon for a video talking about small swords. See you, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.